Welcome. My name is Allison Meyer. A little about my background. I am a former high school social studies teacher who taught primarily in highly impacted schools from Chicago to Denver. And since leaving the classroom, I have had the incredible opportunity to learn about restorative justice practices from leaders of this work across the country. For a couple years, I served as the project manager of the Restorative Justice Partnership, which was a collaboration between Denver Public Schools, the Denver Classroom Teachers Association, the Denver-based community organization Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, the Colorado Education Association, and national partners Advancement Project and the National Education Association. This groundbreaking collective of education stakeholders had a simple focus. How do we implement high-quality restorative practices in schools? And how do we share our learnings with others? Since then, I have served as the district coordinator of restorative practices for both Denver and Jefferson County Public Schools. So it is with those experiences and an immense amount of help from mentors along the way that I'm facilitating this learning today. In this video, I'll be discussing how we can use a restorative approach to address bullying in our classrooms and in our schools. Before we dive into the important nuances of this work, let's ensure that we understand what bullying is and what it is not, and how prevalent it is in our education system. According to a 2019 survey on school safety, about 20% of adolescents report experiencing bullying. Some of the most common behaviors articulated by the students surveyed included being the subject of rumors and lies, being called names, being pushed or shoved, being left out, or being threatened with harm. We know that both victims and perpetrators of bullying are more likely to skip or drop out of school. Often the impacts of bullying follow them into adulthood, where they might be more likely to underperform in employment settings. There is even evidence that suggests that targets of bullying are more likely to develop mental health concerns, such as anxiety, panic disorders, and clinical depression. Bullying is not perpetrated by a small number of students, but rather it is common across grades, gender, socioeconomic status, and all other aspects of identity. So how exactly do we define bullying? According to the Colorado Department of Education, bullying behavior is defined by 3 indicators. First, the student who perpetrated the behavior intended to cause harm. Second, the behavior is repeated over time. That does not mean that as educators, we don't respond to the behavior until it is repeated. We can also assess whether or not the behavior is likely to be repeated and intervene accordingly. Finally, there is an imbalance of power between the perpetrator and the target of the behavior. This might mean that the target is physically smaller than the perpetrator, has less friends or social capital, is younger than the perpetrator. It is also important to recognize how privilege and oppression play a role here. If the target of the bullying behavior belongs to a protected class, and the nature of the bullying is related to their race, disability status, sexual orientation, or another aspect of their identity, the behavior is considered harassment under federal law. Bullying can manifest as verbal, which could be insults and degrading comments, physical, pushing, shoving, or relational, like convincing peers to exclude a person and spreading rumors about them. Increasingly, these bullying behaviors are happening in a virtual world, through texting and on social media. For myself, it is often helpful to not think of cyberbullying as its own category, but rather as relational or verbal bullying that is happening through a different medium. The term bullying is often misappropriated by young people, their caregivers, and educators. Since bullying requires a unique response, it is imperative that we discern whether or not a situation is in fact true bullying. I'll often use the following terms to discuss other forms of unproductive behavior amongst peers. If one student is intentionally causing harm to another, but the behavior is an isolated incident and there's no perceived power differential, I'll call it a mean moment to differentiate it from bullying. If multiple peers are in disagreement with one another, but there's no power differential and no one is intending to cause harm, I'll simply use the word conflict. I find it especially important to be explicit with young people, educators, and their families when we are navigating a peer-to-peer conflict, because conflict is such a natural part of human existence. And mislabeling this behavior as bullying can be a major obstacle in teaching students the skills that they'll need for the rest of their lives to navigate conflict safely and rationally. Bullying is such an emotionally charged term that so often simply by renaming non-bullying behaviors appropriately, I can de-escalate the parties involved so that we can move forward with a thoughtful and appropriate response. On the flip side, by naming bullying when it is happening, I can make certain that I'm supporting the target intentionally by not shaming them for the behavior or for feeling unable to defend themselves, and by connecting them with mental health supports that can help them process the experience. No matter if you are supporting young people working through bullying, mean moments, or peer-to-peer conflict, we want to ensure that we are taking a restorative approach. This means that we should be prepared to both hold the involved students to a high level of accountability and to provide them with a high level of support as they work to change their behavior. Accountability can look like having consistent and clear expectations, establishing and maintaining boundaries, and having logical consequences for our behavior. Support might look like stepping in as a nurturer, listening to the students and validating their feelings and their experiences. Scaffolding supports for the student to be able to meet the expectations we've established for following up on our consequences. When we are in this sweet spot of high accountability and high support, we are doing discipline with the student. And through modeling, this is how we transfer the skills of self-discipline so that the students will be increasingly equipped to navigate future conflicts independently. While we are looking at the social engagement window, it is worth remembering that the bullying behaviors we see in young people are learned behaviors. When I've seen adolescents make these concerning choices, I have often wondered, where are they learning to treat one another in this way? There are the obvious examples of what students are exposed to through the news and online, but I think it's also important to note that when we as educators and caretakers take a punitive approach to discipline, we are inadvertently modeling those bullying behaviors. I've heard the punitive approach to discipline summarized as harming people to show them that harming people is wrong. How confusing is that for a growing child? When in our classrooms and hallways, we say things like, because I said so, or respect all adults, we model for our students using arbitrary power to coerce others into doing what you want. This all accountability and no support approach is perpetuating the bullying behaviors in our schools that we so badly want to eradicate. Best practices in bullying intervention tell us that for the target, we should be connecting them with mental health supports, validating their feelings and experiences, and being generally caring and supportive adults. Targets of bullying don't need to be held accountable, they need to be believed. So in this portion of the video, we'll be focusing on how we are using a restorative approach with the perpetrator of bullying, not the target. Formal conferencing and harm circles are almost never suitable for instances of bullying. I typically use this framework to gauge appropriateness for those formal practices. As I assess a conflict, pre-meet with those involved, and facilitate the practice, I want to be able to answer yes to these questions with a reasonable amount of certainty. I've highlighted the questions that are particularly concerning for bullying. Most likely, the student who has been targeted will not feel safe and empowered to speak their mind to the bully given the power differential. Additionally, as a facilitator, I never want to set a student up to share about themselves and then have that information used as ammunition against them later. This is why we so often hear at restorative justice practices trainings that restorative approaches are inappropriate in instances of bullying. However, I would encourage you to think back on our social engagement window. While a perpetrator-target conversation is not fitting, that doesn't mean that we have to abandon our goal of being restorative. of providing the perpetrator with a high amount of support while holding them accountable for their behavior. I am often asked in trainings if, when formal conferences and harm circles are deemed inappropriate, if that means we just use a punitive response instead. Punitive responses to bullying usually further exacerbate the problem. They encourage students to hide the bullying that has happened, and it further alienates the perpetrators of bullying from the community. We do not have to abandon our restorative approach to an intervention. We have plenty of other options for restorative responses that are beyond formal conferencing and harm circles. It is worth noting before we move on that for mean moments and peer-to-peer conflict, formal conferencing and harm circles are often an amazing tool to resolve those conflicts. Here are the restorative responses to the perpetrators of bullying that I found myself using most often. First, I will often conduct a pre-conference with the student, even if I already have zero intention of bringing the parties together. There is so much reflection and introspection that takes place during a pre-conference, and I can still facilitate that experience for the perpetrator to cultivate empathy for who has been harmed, to create space for them to take responsibility for their actions, to explore ways they might repair the harm that was caused to our larger community. By hearing the student's perspective, I can also assess the root cause of the behavior and start to identify what supports the student needs to change the role that they are currently playing in our community. If I do think that the student would benefit from a dialogue, I might ask a surrogate to stand in as the target of the bullying behavior. This could be a student or an adult. I would not want the surrogate to be sharing the experiences of the actual target of the behavior, as I do not want them to give the perpetrator information they might use against their target while they are still working to change their behavior. Instead, I would be prepping a surrogate to share their own experiences as a target of bullying in their past, or to express how they would have felt if they were the target of the perpetrator's behavior. Another option I have is to have the student engage in a dialogue with a student or an adult who can serve as a mentor to them, someone who has had experience as a perpetrator of bullying and then has successfully changed that behavior. The questions might look a little different than your standard conference, but I could create an environment for the perpetrator to hear the lessons others have learned when they were in a similar situation. Lastly, when addressing the problematic behavior, we want to identify skill gaps that we can then focus on closing as part of our restorative and supportive response. Through a pre-conference, for example, I may discover that the student does not know many strategies for making friends. I can then connect them to resources that can support them in developing this skill set. Notice that each of these three interventions is still restorative in nature, high accountability, and high support, and therefore is likely to be successful in changing behavior if we are consistent and vigilant in our response. An integral part of being accountable for our behavior is taking steps to repair the harm that we have caused to our community. With bullying, it may not always be appropriate for the student to directly repair the harm with the target of their behavior. However, bullying hurts our whole community, and we can have the student focus on repairing the harm to our larger community through a variety of consequences. When it comes to determining consequences for behavior, if we are taking a truly restorative approach, this should be done in partnership with the student. We as adults can support the student in identifying meaningful next steps. For a consequence to be meaningful and effective in repairing harm, I'm usually looking for three indicators. First, is the repair directly related to the harm that was caused? Remember, this can be particularly tricky for bullying, since our initial instinct might be to encourage the perpetrator and the target to strengthen their relationship with one another. Instead, we can focus on the harm that was done to the larger community instead of the harm done to the individual student, so that the target of the behavior does not have to partner with the student who perpetrated the bullying against them. Second, I think about, will the repair steps the student is doing support them in learning? This might be because they develop empathy for targets of bullying or those who have had to intervene when bullying is occurring. This could also look like a commitment to closing a skill gap or a knowledge gap that might be contributing to their behavior. The last thing I consider is, will the repair continue to contribute to the student feeling connected to the school community? Punitive discipline practices damage relationships and push our students away. We want students to grow their connection to and their understanding of our community as they work to repair the harm that they've caused. Because ultimately, our greatest deterrent for this behavior in the future is that the student feels connected and cared for and doesn't want to intentionally harm their people. There are two things I actively avoid when I'm supporting a student in identifying next steps, and those are apologies and promises to never do it again. Unlearning behavior is hard. Promising to never do it again sets up both the student and myself to be disappointed and frustrated if it does happen again. I also prefer not to have students apologize, or at least to have that coupled with some sort of actionable next step that shows their remorse for the behavior. Often, apologies are forced, and therefore they do not meet the needs of the person harmed and sometimes contribute to further harm. By having students apologize as often as we do, we are inadvertently teaching them that there are two magical words that you can say, "I'm sorry," that excuse any behavior. Particularly concerning with instances of bullying, we can also set the person up who is being apologized to have to accept the apology. From a trauma-sensitive space, we also don't want to recreate cycles of abuse in our schools, where the perpetrator of violence apologizes, the target accepts, and then the perpetrator continues to harm them. If a student authentically wants to apologize, I'll usually remind them that their recent actions have probably led them to not being trusted by the person they've harmed. So since our words won't have as much meaning right now, what's something we can do to show we are sorry? I can also ask the target if they are open to hearing an apology, then work with the perpetrator to craft a thoughtful statement. I would also work with the target to give them options for what accepting or not accepting the apology might sound like. Again, my preference would be to have this be something that happens in tandem with other meaningful steps to repair harm, or that an apology doesn't happen at all. So let's explore some options for what those other tangible next steps might look like. When we are working with a student to identify next steps, they might be at a loss for how they can start to repair the hurt that they've caused. Identifying a plan to make things right is a high expectation, so I need to provide a high amount of support. I like to have a list of ideas for the student. They can either choose from this list or use it to inspire their own ideas. Here are some examples I've used in the past. If the target had any property damaged, or if any school property was damaged, it would make perfect logical sense for part of the student's plan to repair the harm to include repairing or replacing that property. This also supports learning and understanding the cost of the damages that might have been caused and allows them to re-enter the school community in good faith. The student and I might find ways that they can contribute to creating a safe and inclusive environment wherever the behavior occurred. For example, if the bullying behavior happened in the bathroom, maybe they can create posters for the backs of stalls about how to identify bullying and where to report it. If the bullying was occurring at recess, maybe they can work with adults to identify where the unsupervised spaces are or what recess stations seem to have the most conflicts. If their behavior occurred at lunch, maybe the student commits to spending a week being a force for positivity at lunch, offering to return their peers' trays when they finish their meals, asking each table a fun would you rather question, being DJ lunchroom every Friday for a month. It might be helpful to give the student a role where they can identify and reward pro-social behaviors by peers in the environment where the behavior occurred. I once worked with two fourth grade girls who were convinced that everyone was being a bully at recess and there was nothing unique about their behavior. We worked together to make a list of pro-social behaviors, and then we turned it into a scavenger hunt. They brought their lists out to recess and had to find students exhibiting things like including someone new in a game or helping keep the playground clean. This consequence helped them realize that their behavior was abnormal and harmful and gave them ideas for how to be a better community member. For students who are struggling to see the impact of their behavior, you might encourage them to research bullying and report back. If the students that they targeted was based on their identity, they maybe might research the history of privilege and identity, privilege and oppression in that identity. Then you can have them share what they've learned, either with trusted adults or with peers as appropriate. I love the idea of having a student create a lesson or class discussion that would mitigate this behavior from happening in the future. Maybe it's a lesson on how to be a good friend, or maybe they're developing a week's worth of circle prompts to prevent bullying. Many students, as they grow their awareness and understanding of bullying behavior, will want to reach out to the target. You can encourage them to write a letter to the target expressing what they've learned from this experience. And the letter doesn't necessarily have to be delivered for the experience of writing it to be healing for the student who caused harm. Additionally, as the student shows growth and success in changing their behavior, they might volunteer to serve as a surrogate or to share their story to help others avoid making their same mistakes. This list of suggestions is by no means exhaustive. Students will also have amazing ideas as how they can reintegrate back into the community. As adults, it is our job to help them come up with a comprehensive plan, not to dictate a list of consequences. Restorative justice practices can also be used proactively to create a culture where bullying behaviors are just unacceptable. If your school or district uses a bullying prevention program, restorative justice practices such as circles can be used to supplement and practice this social-emotional learning. Here are some ideas of how you could use circles to create a culture of belonging. You might design prompts that support students in establishing guidelines for spaces where we know bullying is happening, like online or at recess. We can keep these guidelines fresh in students' minds by having them commit to a guideline of focus as part of a circle before we enter those areas. We can build students' self-awareness about the role they play in their friend groups. We can debrief actual incidents that the students have experienced and problem solve how they can be better advocates in the future. Or we could respond to role-playing scenarios and imagine and practice what we'd do if we found ourselves in that position. This can help students understand the roles of bystanders and upstanders in bullying. We can also teach and reinforce pro-social behaviors by having students share with one another how they navigate building trust with others or holding one another accountable. And beyond circles that are explicitly designed to build this skill set, remember that all circles will contribute to connectedness, which is pivotal in bullying prevention. Additionally, we can help students with it by building their social, emotional, and restorative skill sets. Some of my favorite restorative practices to teach students are how to use restorative language, both in the form of I statements to express our boundaries and open-ended questions to build relationships and navigate conflicts. We can and should be explicit about what constitutes a healthy relationship. Adults and children alike struggle to articulate what this looks like. We can support students in responsible decision-making, how to be an upstander. When do I need to actually reach out to an adult for help? For families, students, and educators, we can provide training on social media apps and sites. I recently worked with a student who, when targeted for cyberbullying, knew how to send a link that captured the other student's IP address when they clicked on it. Her tech savviness allowed us to support both the perpetrator in changing their behavior, because we knew who the student was now, and her in processing what happened. Many of our families and educators don't understand the sites that their students are using, so they struggle with coming up with guidelines for using them. Finally, we must support students, staff, and families in how to identify bullying and what to do when they see it. Because the research is conclusive. True bullying requires an adult intervention. And even though there are plenty of reasons to not use conferences or harm circles, we can still be restorative in our approach to addressing bullying behaviors. Thank you for listening.